Hello, welcome to our virtual conference. If you have not been if you've not been involved in the previous panels, today's panel is a conversation about the historical roots of policing in the United States and elsewhere. And we're joined by three very excellent panelists. I'm going to briefly introduce them now and then give you full bios right before we begin. We're following both program order and alphabetical order. We're going to hear from Simon Balto, who's the professor of history and African American studies at University of Iowa. Then we will hear from Anna Levovsky, who's an assistant professor of law at Harvard Law School. And finally, Stewart Schroeder, who is associate director of the program in racism, immigration, and citizenship, and a lecturer in sociology at Johns Hopkins University. So first today we have Simon Balto. Again, assistant professor of history and African American studies at University of Iowa. His first book, Occupied Territory, Policing Black Chicago from Red Summer to Black Power, was published by UNC Press in 2019 and is the recipient of the Benjamin Hooks Institute's National Book Award for the best book on the civil rights movement and its legacy. He's currently working on two new books. One is a highly anticipated political biography of Illinois Black Panther leader Fred Hampton, and the other is a history of white criminals who donned blackface before committing crimes. So we will begin with Simon Balto. And before we begin, let me just say we have this Q&A function here in the Zoom. So please go ahead and use that function. You can vote up questions that you would like answered. I will do my best to field these questions. You can do this at any point during our program. And if you would like to, I'd love to hear kind of what brings you to the panel, your name, anything you'd like to share about where you're coming from, whether that's community institutions here in Chicago or elsewhere. We'd love to know who's here. So thank you very much. And now Simon Balto.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. So I want to begin with just kind of one big sort of macro point about the history of policing, and then I want to burrow a little bit deeper down into some of the things that I think are significant about the book that came out last year and how it can help us kind of better understand policing and the crisis of policing in the United States. So the macro point that I want to make that I think is useful to be considering and thinking about in this particular moment when we're thinking about and trying to reimagine what policing looks like and what it should look like if it should exist at all, and so on and so forth. I think it's useful to know that police, generally speaking, were not founded in the United States with a primary mission of public safety in mind. So in other words, when Chicago gets its police department in the 1850s, when southern cities get their first police departments, we can look at a variety of contexts, and the driving motivation for the implementation of those police forces is not to protect kind of a generic public interest. So what I mean by that is that if you look, for example, at a variety of southern cities and some cities on the eastern seaboard, oftentimes the police departments that get put in place in those places derive from or overlap with slave patrols. So in other words, they grow alongside or out of institutions that are literally charged with the task of criminalizing Black freedom and of criminalizing Blackness, of treating Black people free and enslaved with suspicion. And in other words, that there's a lot of bleed between the early police departments in those cities and a distinct interest in controlling Black people. If we shift our attention to a city like Chicago, when Chicago's police department is implemented in the 1850s, the primary drivers for it are control of immigrant behavior, in particular the control of German and Irish immigrants, for not really like things that we would consider criminal, but for things that people thought were immoral. So, for example, German drinking habits were a really big concern of city boosters and city elites at that moment. And so they are the ones that demand and indeed fund the original iteration of the Chicago Police Department. So it's not meant to, at that founding moment, just keep people safe. It's meant to control people's behavior that does no one else really any harm. And then from there, the kind of secondary chronologically, but certainly not secondarily in terms of importance, piece of the puzzle that the Chicago Police Department does is to control workers and to help break strikes and so on and so forth. And so the reason that I say that is because when we are in this particular moment where we are thinking about the police as a society more critically than collectively, at least more critically. I mean, certainly, plenty of people and activists have been doing, critical thinking about the carceral system for a very long time. But as this conversation is existing within the mainstream, I think it's really important for people to understand that if we're going to hold up, public safety as this red herring for why we can't have really critical conversations about the very legitimacy and existence of the police, I think it's important for people to understand that when the police were put in place in the first place in the United States, it generally speaking was not to keep people safe. It was to enact control over people who, various elites deemed necessitating control. So whether that be racial control, whether that be economic control, that those were the primary purposes of the police in the first place. And so we can, talk about how, the role of police in society has changed or perhaps not changed all that much in the intervening, 150, 170 years since those first police departments were put in place. But I think it's important to begin from that perspective when we are thinking about this, that, if we are saying the police are required to keep people safe, that was not why they existed in the first place. So I lead with that. And I just want to say a few other things about the research that I did in Chicago, and I think it's important for helping us understand and make sense of what's happening right now. So when I first came to this project, I first started research for what became this book in 2010. And I was living in Chicago. I was living in Chicago earlier on the previous decade, which was sort of when the ideas for this what became this book first started to percolate. But so when I started research on this project and wanted to, better understand the just fundamental anti-Blackness of policing in a city like Chicago, when I first started wanting to do that work, I did what any, aspiring historian would do, and I read what other people had written on things related to the subject. And what was really striking to me was that at that point in time, so 10 years ago now, most of what had been written on the kind of policing and larger mass incarceration system that it is a part of, most of what had been written really, really, really was focused on kind of the war on drugs and maybe the war on crime as being these fundamentally transformative moments in the history of policing and punishment in the United States. And it's not to say that those two, quote unquote, wars were unimportant, but it is to say that, if we look at the 1960s in a city like Chicago, you have Black activists who are talking already at that point in time about how disruptive and abusive and violent the police are in Black communities. And at the same time, a lot of people are talking about how the police department just still doesn't keep Black people safe in Chicago. And so, we look at 50 years ago, and there's a lot of Black activists who are having very similar conversations to what a lot of activists and organizers are saying right now, which is, for example, in the early 70s, you have the Panthers in Chicago, the Black Panther Party, when they are pushing for community control of the police, they're effectively making arguments to defund the police. They're saying, look, not only should we decentralize the police and give people in the communities control over what policing should look like in their individual neighborhoods, but let's take big chunks of the hundreds of millions of dollars that the city of Chicago was already at that point in time spending on the police force and reinvest it into social goods that will help the community rather than cause harm to it. And so when I was thinking through how I would approach this project, it really was sort of a conundrum. And the conundrum is this, that if we start thinking about the police and we start thinking about the problem that policing is, if we start thinking about it from the vantage point of the drug and crime wars, then how do we make sense of the fact that by the end of the 1960s, a police department in a city like Chicago is incredibly well funded, has enormous bipartisan support, has entrenched legitimacy in the eyes of a majority of its citizenry, has widespread carte blanche to do things like stop and frisk, saturate black neighborhoods, engage in wanton brutality with absolute impunity. How do we make sense of that? In a way, how do we make sense of that if we're just thinking about the drug and crime wars? And so, really, what became this book was an effort to kind of unravel how policing took shape on the ground and how people experienced policing over time, it kind of in the buildup to the drug and crime wars. And really what I think a critical takeaway to understand about this is the power of local actors in shaping what policing looks like. I know that part of the conversation that we're going to have, is about the, kind of the international, components and intellectual threads and tactical strategies that circulate among various people. And I think that that's also incredibly important. But looking at the history of the Chicago Police Department and the ways in which it pivots very hard and very noticeably towards a regime that actively punishes and criminalizes blackness and brownness and queerness and all sorts of other identities. When we look at how that regime takes shape in Chicago, it's a remarkably local story. And so I think people have to understand that when we're going to think about the ghouls who create the system of mass incarceration, we have to understand that the ghouls are not just like the J. Edgar Hoovers and the Richard Nixons and the Ronald Reagans of the world, but rather it's also the Richard Daleys, it's the Orlando Wilsons, who was the CPD superintendent in the 1960s. It was the Timothy O'Connors, who was the CPD commissioner before Wilson, and so on and so forth. That these are actors who, over the span of decades, are engaged in a project of regime building that is intensely localized. That the city of Chicago, even when the war on crime starts, the city of Chicago is still dumping a huge amount of a vast majority of the money for the police department comes directly from the city. It doesn't come from the federal government. And so that is a system and a series of choices that were made by city actors and people within the police department over time. And so I think it's really important, again, that when we're trying to think about how we unravel these systems and how we, scale back police power in the United States, it's important that we are very aware of, thinking locally. The other just quick things that I want to say, Chicago gets held up, by Trump and others all the time as, because, the summer being another case in point of, just tragically violent summers, tragically violent years in Chicago. And it gets held up by conservatives and plenty of liberals too, as kind of a case study of why we need more police. If that supposedly the answer to solving this crisis in which so many young Black and brown people are dying violent deaths via gun violence, people say, well, look, we can solve that if we have more cops in the streets. It's an anti-abolitionist argument. I think it's important to understand that then, as historically, it's actually the opposite. That really what we are talking about is that being proof that policing does not work. Because the kind of twin threads that I am talking about throughout the book are that on the one hand, Black Chicago becomes a site of dramatic over-policing. increased surveillance, increased radically disproportionate stop and frisk, radically disproportionate officer-involved violence, and so on and so forth. So on the one hand, Black Chicago becomes a place of extreme over-policing. And on the other hand, Black Chicago's neighborhoods are, generally speaking, still wildly more susceptible to intercommunal violence. And so you have these two twin threads of what Black activists in the 1960s were calling both over-patrolling and underprotecting. And those are the twinned experiences that a lot of Black Chicagoans, deal with and confront when it comes to the system of policing in the city. And so if you are going to take those two things side by side, over policing and under protection, you have to ask yourself what the hell the point is, because it's proof positive that policing cannot keep people safe, and that we have to, imagine other means of, reducing harm and keeping people safe. And it's really profound to listen to activists, listen to organizers from the 60s and early 70s who were making these arguments and just see the resonance that they hold now. And I think it's important to understand that they were building, just as activists and organizers right now are building off of the labors of generations of other activists, so too were those activists in the 1960s and 70s doing the same thing. I mean, you can look at the Black press in Chicago from as early as the 1940s, and they are talking about the Chicago Police Department literally using the language of terrorism, that they call the police terrorists as early as the 1940s. And so when we're thinking about the roots of this crisis, we have to understand that it is generations deep, and it is baked into the cake of a department like the Chicago Police Department. And I'm up against my time, so I'll stop there and turn it back to Kathleen.
Thank you very much, Simon. And I think this will generate wonderful questions in our Q&A. Our next presenter is Anna Levovsky, who is an assistant professor of law at Harvard Law School, where she teaches courses on the history of policing, criminal law, and evidence. Her first book, Vice Patrol: Cops, Courts, and the Struggle Over Urban Gay Life Before Stonewall, examines the policing of gay and lesbian communities in the mid-20th century, focusing on the relationship between anti-gay policing and shifting public understandings of gay life. It's coming out early next year with University of Chicago Press. Her other work focuses on criminal procedure, judicial reasoning, and the politics of expert knowledge in court. So I will turn it over to Anna.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kathleen. And thank you to join the organizers of this fantastic conference for inviting us to give some historical background. So as Kathleen mentioned, my historical research focuses primarily on the policing of gay life at mid-century, which is a variant of morals policing. It's a type of policing as social regulation and social control, exactly as Simon discussed. And I'm happy to discuss that in the Q&A. But given the organizing principles of this conference, which is about examining the limitations of police reform and reformist thinking, I wanted to focus on another aspect of my work, which is about judicial reasoning about the police. And I want to present here one legal history of police reform, examining how a pervasive and troubling pattern in judicial analysis of police conduct today traces back to an essentially unsuccessful reform effort in the mid-20th century. My core point, simply put, is that debates about the costs and benefits of reformist approaches have to make some room for thinking about the courts, for thinking about how these reforms play out not only on the ground in changing actual police practice, but also how they change how police practices are assessed in other channels of accountability. So critiques of incrementalist and technocratic reforms over the past months especially have generally taken two primary forms. First is that reforms are ineffective. So many big city police departments already have many of the proposed reforms in place: cameras, use of force policies, sensitivity training, but they still engage in profound violence and illegality. And a corollary here is that reforms might actually make policing worse. So historically, managerial technocratic reforms have accelerated hostile encounters between police and over-policed communities and communities of color, or they've legitimated abusive and racist patterns of policing. And the historian Charlotte Rosen has recently posted a really great historical overview of this trend. The second core bucket of critique is that reform sap political will for more meaningful change. So reformist thinking siphons off inherently limited political resources, attention, and capital from conversations about more radical change. And it appeases concerns about the problem by suggesting that certain pathologies within contemporary policing might be patched up by institutional tweaks. So I want to propose a third bucket, which is that institutional and technocratic reforms don't just frustrate other political responses and avenues of change, they frustrate what avenues exist for judicial oversight of the police, because due to the unique institutional pressures that guide judicial thinking, the language of reform is very much the language of the courts. So I'm going to focus here on an example I've written about in depth, which is the history of police training at mid-century. But this dynamic isn't limited to this one example, and I'll touch on some other examples at the end. So the 20th century featured a series of controversial efforts at police reform, of which one of the most notable was a self-proclaimed movement towards police professionalization, which reached its peak in the 1950s, early 1960s. So the first wave of professionalization traced back to the turn of the century, associated with the progressive movement, and it was driven primarily by concerns about corruption and political influence during the machine political era. The second wave began to gather steam around the 1930s. It also aimed to combat political influence, but it was crucially also concerned with certain broader critiques of the police emerging from the experience of prohibition and increasing attention to police brutality and abuses, especially in Black communities, all of which led to public perceptions of the police, on the one hand, as lazy, idle, and incompetent, on the other hand, as overzealous, violent, untrustworthy. And so in context, this reform movement was very much a public relations effort. It was aiming to recast police officers not as incompetent brutes, but as the name implies, respectable professionals. So reformers pursued a series of administrative shifts, centralizing power with police chiefs, streamlining channels of command within departments, but they also deliberately recast individual police officers as both dedicated public servants and crucially as experts in their own field. Partly they did so by raising educational and similar entrance requirements to make the process seem more selective, but they also did so through a growing emphasis on formal training, academy courses, both for officers in specialized units and high-level forensics training, but also training for all recruits, introductory courses for all police recruits, which included, among other things, a type of training in a loose pseudo-ethnographic knowledge, how to recognize criminal or suspicious behavior based on subtle visual clues that police officers knew based on training and experience, but most people wouldn't recognize. And this rhetoric of expert police officers bearing some specialized knowledge in their own field, pervaded debates about professionalism in these years, including reformist conferences and publications, as well as magazines written by and aimed at the rank and file. So the practical benefits of this rise in academy training are suspect, and they were suspect at the time. In the 1960s, critics commonly noted that police training programs were rudimentary, based on vague and outdated materials, deeply inconsistent across police departments. And in particular, observers rejected this claim that police officers had any genuinely reliable expertise in perceiving crime or danger on the streets, arguing in particular that police expert wisdom, so-called expert wisdom, essentially just repackaged racist presumptions about the boundaries of ordinary or suspicious behavior in the public sphere. But around these exact same years, the idea of the police officer as an expert on crime began to have very serious impact in court. So beginning around the mid-1950s, right as police reformers began recasting officers as experts, state courts began welcoming police officers as expert witnesses on criminal behavior and related topics at trial. So sometimes they did this by redesignating officers as formal experts on topics they had long testified about as lay witnesses, such as forensics, recognizing drugs, translating slang, and sometimes by admitting police witnesses on topics that had previously been seen to require medical or scientific expertise, typically regarding recognizing the signs of drug use. The bases of these expert qualifications were especially notable. So in the first years of this phenomenon, police officers were typically qualified as experts on the basis of extensive personal experience, years on the job, hundreds or thousands of arrests, sometimes teaching academy courses as those courses proliferated. But as academy programs became increasingly common, judges began qualifying police expert witnesses on the basis of essentially any hallmarks of formal training, including sometimes just a handful of arrest and introductory courses on the subject. And so this trend in part reflects the informal bar on qualifying expert witnesses, but in effect it meant that the proliferation of formal training, whatever its practical effects in improving police practices on the ground, meaningfully expanded the status of police witnesses in court. So within a few years, the same trend spilled into the legal arena most directly associated with police expertise today, just Fourth Amendment challenges to searches and seizures. So judicial assessments of probable cause and reasonable suspicion today are highly deferential to police judgment on the principle that trained, experienced officers have expert insights into the hallmarks of crime. This view has been repeatedly endorsed by the Supreme Court, suffuses the lower courts, and it has been profoundly criticized, again, on the grounds that police judgment is actually deeply unreliable. It's very easily reverse engineered to justify a particular search or seizure, and that it often tracks race more than any other sensible criminological factor. But this trend of deference to police judgment began again in the late 1950s as reformers were promoting training programs and emphasizing police expert knowledge. And it crucially drew directly on the court's experiences with police witnesses themselves. So in defending the proposition that police officers have reliable professional knowledge to which courts should defer, judges routinely invoked the growing practice of police officers testifying as expert witnesses. And sometimes they would actually go ahead and accidentally qualify police officers at suppression hearings as expert witnesses, which doesn't make any sense as a matter of law, but it suggests that judges' views of police knowledge were so shaped by their experience with expert witnesses that they essentially confused the context. So again, this massive controversial development in the court's constitutional oversight of the police, deference to police expert judgment, responded both to contemporary efforts at police reform and to the court's own prior encounters with the police in other legal spheres. And finally, very quickly, this notion of police expertise exercised such power over the judicial imagination that in the 1970s, it even inflected scrutiny of the constitutionality of criminal statutes. After the Supreme Court invalidated the traditional vagrancy regime in 1972, various states and cities began to experiment with other broad laws to authorize proactive policing, such as loitering with criminal intent or loitering under suspicious circumstances. These were immediately challenged for vagueness, and many courts struck them down. But other judges drew directly on the promise of police expertise, reasoning that a police officer's professional talent at inferring guilt from circumstantial evidence would mitigate any concern about overbroad or unreliable enforcement. And again, in defending this proposition, they would cite directly to their prior encounters with police knowledge in the law of evidence and the Fourth Amendment. And many of these broad quality of life laws are still operative and widely used today. So all of this is to say, over the course of the 1950s and 1960s, police reformers' emphasis on formal police training and attempts to recast officers as bearing some expert knowledge had limited practical effect on the ground, and limited practical effect with many of the sensible targets of this public relations effort that were criticized as having little effect. Yet these efforts played a significant role in court, inflating the status of police witnesses at trial, exacting deference to police judgment at suppression hearings, and even helping to preserve a number of extremely broad criminal statutes. So why did this reform effort have such an outsized impact in court? So I would suggest a couple of reasons which reflect the court's unique institutional pressures and their relationship with other agents of the criminal justice system. So first, judges were often exposed to the processes and products of police reform in a way that likely inclined them to take that project more seriously than other observers. Outside the courtroom, judges of mid-century lectured at police academies. They attended professionalism-related conferences, sometimes on the strategic invitation of police chiefs and reformers to impress them with the gains of police reform. These experiences introduced judges to the idea of policemen as professionals or experts, and they likely gave them an optimistic view of the value and the extent of police training. Within the courtroom itself, judges beginning in the 1950s routinely encountered police officers styled as experts by the prosecution, and these officers were often selected, particularly in the first years, for their genuinely impressive credentials. At trial, judges were nudged towards recognizing police officers as experts by the relatively informal standards for qualifying expert testimony. At suppression hearings, judges systematically confronted claims of police expertise in contexts where the police officer's professional judgment was in fact vindicated, leading to criminal evidence or to an arrest. And again, these experiences gave judges repeated examples of police knowledge and contributed to an aggregate impression of police expertise as a robust shared feature of the profession. And in my writing on this, I emphasize especially the interconnections between these different encounters, so how certain selection biases and doctrinal pressures in any one sphere of judicial interaction with police knowledge didn't just inflate the court's sense of police knowledge and competency within that area, but also influenced judicial reasoning in other spheres. The second core point is that certain well-debated institutional pressures that mediate judges' relationships with other legal actors likely again incline them to respect claims of institutional competency by the police. These include the desire to maintain their professional relationships with repeat players, to diminish or to streamline their own workloads. It includes inculcated values of minimalism and non-interference with other government branches, and of course, sympathy for the prosecution, particularly since many judges themselves were prosecutors in their previous lives. These pressures also include the fact that many judges, as products of elite training and as presiders over a legal system built on gradual change, are themselves technocrats and small c conservatives, open and optimistic about the possibilities of internal institutional reform. And all of these pressures generally incline judges to extend to other legal actors a presumption of regularity, and that presumption extends as well to any institutional reforms enacted by the police. I would suggest that it was these features that combined to make judges take seriously and build an entire jurisprudence around a claim about police competency and professionalism that few observers outside the court took seriously or really take seriously today. So that's just one historical example of how even an unsuccessful reform may impact judicial reasoning in a way that profoundly limits police accountability in court. And very quickly, I want to emphasize that it's not the only example. So first, beyond the promise of expert knowledge, other institutional legacies of mid-century reform, including the formalization of disciplinary channels and the identification of police officers as professionals, have also been influential. So in the 2006 case, Hudson versus Michigan, the Supreme Court declined to exclude evidence procured through a no-knock warrant, a violation of the Fourth Amendment in this case, reasoning that the increasing professionalism of police forces, including avenues of internal discipline since the 1950s, was sufficient to deter civil rights violations. Now, in fact, for a variety of reasons, officers rarely face internal consequences for overzealous behavior that in fact leads to evidence or arrests. But again, the notion of some institutionalized channels of discipline struck the court as an effective safeguard, making it less necessary to intervene. Second is an example that's really at the center of debates about policing today, under use of force policies such as force continuums or de-escalation training. So when the 8 Can't Wait proposals appeared earlier this summer, critics quickly noted that a lot of these reforms were already implemented in many departments, including the Minneapolis Police Department. But the key isn't that these types of formal directives and policies just fail to prevent violence by the police. their very existence as the apparent traces of the profession's reasoned wisdom about its own best practices has actually actively defanged judicial review of excessive force claims. So scholars like Asagi Obasagi and Zachary Newman have found that courts often defer to internal policies, not just as a floor, but as a ceiling on legal liability, taking general compliance with such policies as de facto evidence of reasonableness for closing more searching review. So these, again, are examples of ways in which the formal traces, the ability of police officers to point to the fact, or police departments to point to the fact that they've implemented internal policies and internal reforms, meaningfully frustrates accountability for the police in court. And I'll just end by saying over the last decade or so, scholarly debates about policing, certainly in the legal academy, have often begun by recognizing the limits of judicially imposed channels of accountability and emphasizing the importance of thinking about the police less as agents within a legal ecosystem, answering to other traditional legal actors than agents in a political ecosystem. And I think that's a really important insight. But there's also a sense in which when thinking about the downsides and the promises of reformist approaches, I think it's critical to recognize the police as part of a traditional legal ecosystem, because that view illuminates certain important downstream effects of reformist efforts and reformist thinking, how changes and reforms that are ineffective in reducing police harm on the ground can actually be very effective in shifting the way the courts think about the police in assessing legal challenges. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Anna. This needs no transition. We will go directly into our next piece. And I am very confident that at the end, we will have a conversation that brings all of this together. Our next presenter is Stewart Schroeder. He is Associate Director of the Program in Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship, and a lecturer in sociology at Johns Hopkins University. He is the author of Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing, which came out last year at University of California Press. He's also at work on a new project called To Protect and Serve Themselves, Police in U.S. Politics from Nixon to Trump, about the transformation of police into a new type of political force in the United States. So I will turn it over to Stewart now.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. And I'd like to thank Julian and the organizers for putting together this conference. And it's great to be on this panel. So in my brief remarks today, I'm just going to give an overview of some of the arguments that I make in my book, Badges Without Borders. And this book is a history of U.S. aid and assistance to police in the so-called Third World at the height of the Cold War. And it also looks at the effects of this program on policing at home. And I think that hopefully some of what I'll say will complement not only what my fellow panelists have said, but the previous panel that was about comparative perspectives, as well as issues that came up yesterday. So just to sort of telegraph 3 or 4 things that I hope can enrich our conversation, I'd like to argue first that US police expertise, innovation, and reform have never been purely domestic in character. That's a starting point. Second, the prosecution of the Cold War in the Third World relied on some of the most liberal and reformist policing experts, many of the people that Anna was just speaking about in her presentation, in fact, had global career itineraries. Third, the extreme violence of the Cold War in the Third World was often facilitated by police reforms, which often brought new technologies of surveillance and data management, as well as, of course, new weapons, and also tended to create or expand police forces and specialized units within them. And then just to bring it up to the present, current concerns about both the so-called militarization of policing through the Department of Defense 1033 program and other factors, as well as the operation of the specially trained units of federal agents that we've been seeing in Portland. These, in many ways, are only the latest manifestation of a long trend of US war making and counterinsurgency overseas, reverberating domestically to shape social and political affairs on our city streets. So focused on the 3 decades after the end of World War II, my book excavates the deep linkages between the Cold War US program of police assistance to 52 other countries that was formalized in 1962 as the Office of Public Safety, and the growth of the domestic war on crime in the United States. I show how national security bureaucrats conceived of police as what they called the first line of defense against communism in newly independent states of Asia and Africa, as well as the rapidly developing republics of Latin America. And that phrase, the first line of defense, migrated from J. Edgar Hoover to top leaders of the Central Intelligence Agency to the professional police literature of mid-century policing, which suggests deep entanglements across bureaucratic domains that we tend to often study in isolation from one another. Now, overall, Badges Without Borders illustrates how law enforcement experts imagined their task of police reform and professionalization as global in scope. And the reason for them is that at stake was the loyalty and security of hundreds of millions of people who, in their minds, might tilt their loyalty to Washington if these police leaders succeeded, or to Moscow, Beijing, or Havana if they failed. And many of the key players in this project of global counterinsurgency were themselves drawn from the top echelons of mid-century police reformism, as I said. They were collaborators with people like Orlando Wilson, whom Simon just mentioned, who ended his career as the superintendent of Chicago's police force. Some of them were students of these prominent figures like Wilson. They published in the policing professional journals and textbooks. They taught at universities like Northwestern, Michigan State, University of California. They were police chiefs in small towns like Walnut Creek, California, or Richmond, Indiana. Or they were high-ranking commanding officers in large cities like Los Angeles. Many of them had careers with the Border Patrol or other federal law enforcement agencies, and many also had wartime experience, sometimes in special operations in World War II, in grueling campaigns of guerrilla warfare in Asia. And oftentimes after they went overseas under the auspices of the Office of Public Safety, many of them continued their careers in law enforcement subsequently from the 70s forward. The director of the Office of Public Safety was named Byron Engel, and he started out as a police trainer in Kansas City and went on to become one of the most overlooked, but I think influential figures of the post-1945 national security state. Even after he retired and his health was declining, and the Office of Public Safety was just a memory for some people because it shut down in 1974-75. Law enforcement experts would write letters to the White House saying, bring Engel back out of retirement, bring him back into the fold because we need his type of leadership all around the world. So what was the world situation that Engel entered at the end of World War II? I want to emphasize that policing, and particularly the professionalized variant that we're talking about in this panel in some ways in the mid-20th century, for its leaders, it was supposed to be perfectly compatible with modernization of countries abroad and with the project of racial liberalism that was to define the post-World War II American-led world. Now, despite the role of police in enforcing racial rule in the US, national security leaders and police leaders thought police reform would be essential to winning approval in the emerging third world, not least by avoiding the types of racist abuses that were so common. This again feeds exactly into what Anna was talking about. Reform would ameliorate prior forms of abuse in their way of thinking, but of course we know that they were not always successful. And policing would become integral to the project of capitalist development abroad as new urban landscapes arose, new industrial production routines emerged, and so on and so forth. But it was supposed to be compatible with managed forms of democracy and newly won independence and sovereignty. It empowered local elites, but it also employed native police to engage in the control of people who looked like them, who had similar backgrounds, spoke the same language, and had the same skin color. By preventing the outbreak of subversion and the rise of revolutionary movements, this police reform was designed abroad to be counterinsurgent in orientation. But policing under US guidance in this schema would avoid recapitulating the types of direct colonial rule that characterized the declining European empires. So the book examines a few key figures in the creation of the bureaucratic infrastructure of police assistance and the transfer of this model of overseas police assistance to the field of domestic crime efforts. So let me just focus on that, anti-crime efforts, I should say. So let me focus on that latter part for a moment. And I'll bring up one expert on police reform whose name was Arnold Sagalin. Sagalin did two important things. One is that he drew on his experience working with the Office of Public Safety to help craft blueprints for what ultimately became the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which was the federal agency created in 1968 to distribute resources from Washington to police in states and municipalities across the globe. He explicitly argued that to prevent crime and to prevent civil unrest in the United States, local police needed new resources and they needed new forms of expertise that could only be effectively delivered from Washington. And he said quite explicitly, we know how to do this because we're already doing it all across the globe through the Office of Public Safety, which does exactly the same thing. It delivers resources and expertise to countries far away. And the second key point about Arnold Sagalin is that he went on to lead the research into policing for the Kerner Commission. And he invited his buddy, Byron Engel, whom I mentioned, the director of the Office of Public Safety, to testify before the Kerner Commission, in a sense, legitimizing on a grand stage the transfer of what I call counterinsurgent knowledge from the foreign policy world and the intelligence world to the world of domestic law enforcement. Now, if you were in the world of professionalization and reform in the 1950s and 60s in the United States, you probably already knew Byron Engel. But if you were just a reader of the newspaper at that point, you probably did not know his name. So what did this transfer look like in practice? The book explains how the Overseas Police Assistance Program operated, examining episodes from countries like Guatemala, South Vietnam, the Dominican Republic, and others. And it shows how key features of the police response to political upheaval of the Black freedom movements of the 1960s intersected with the Overseas Counterinsurgency Program. So, for example, through coordination between the White House, the Department of Justice, the Army, and the Office of Public Safety, a whole new program at the national level for riot control training would be developed beginning around 1968, in part based on the recommendations of the Kerner Commission. And that was called the Senior Officers Civil Disturbance Operations Course. And it operated throughout the 1970s, but it was also copied by the state of California quite explicitly to create California's Specialized Training Institute, which is still in existence to this day. Another dimension that I look at in the book, which is something that's on people's minds these days, was the introduction of the chemical weapon CS, or tear gas. I show how the Johnson administration justified the use of CS in Vietnam by claiming untruthfully that it was widely used by police in the United States. The reason that was untrue is that other chemicals were used by police in the United States, but not CS, which was relatively newly adopted by the military. But they then turned around and used the experience of this chemicals deployment in Vietnam to inform police in the United States. And so starting in 1968, police in the United States adopted CS, and it became the most common crowd control chemical. Obviously, it's being used a lot today. And I would also point out, just to keep on the present, one of the federal law enforcement units deployed in Portland is a unit called BORTAC, which is the Border Patrol's SWAT team, essentially. It's descended from the original SWAT idea, which many scholars have pointed out comes from Los Angeles. In the book, I examine the SWAT team and show not only how it had origins in Los Angeles, but how the LAPD itself was deeply enmeshed in this global counterinsurgency program, even before the creation of the SWAT team. So I trace many of those types of networks and genealogies. And finally, the book concludes by looking at some conservative intellectuals who facilitated the rise of law and order politics in the United States, showing how they participated in debates around counterinsurgency practices that then influenced their thinking about policing. And I argue that to the extent that we appreciate something like broken windows theory as a kind of paradigm shift that changed law enforcement in the decades after it was originally kind of enunciated in 1982 by Kelling and Wilson, I argue that we should pay closer attention to the genealogy of the ideas it contains, recognizing that they emerged in some debates about counterinsurgency, and some of the very notions that are baked into broken windows theory came out of thinking of the Office of Public Safety and other key thinkers talking about counterinsurgency at that point. And once we recognize that genealogy, I think it gives us a better sense of what some of these law and order theories are trying to achieve. So overall, by tracing the international travels of law enforcement experts, their technologies that they introduce, the institutions that they develop, I hope that Badges Without Borders highlights the possibility and the value of thinking about the growth of the US carceral state in transnational fashion, while also considering anew how empire reverberates at home. And I'd argue that it's not only the so-called militarized form of policing in the US that is a product of war and empire, but also the very procedural reformism that has been a topic throughout this conference and already on this panel has always been both exported by police experts around the globe from the United States and then imported back home in updated and newly crafted forms. It's been central, police reform has been central to the US bid for geopolitical power and influence. And maybe I will just say as a last point, even as there are profound questions right now about the US role on the global stage, it remains the case that US police experts, as we speak, are operating around the globe, doing many of the training and technical assistance types of operations that date back to the middle of the 20th century. So this history is still very much with us today. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I'm going to invite all our panelists to turn their video back on now for our Q&A. We have until 1 o'clock Central, which is about 35 minutes. I'll just remind everyone who may have joined mid-session that we have this great Q&A function here at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may also go and read the questions that have already been asked and vote up the questions you'd like us to address, which is a great feature. Okay, there are a number of excellent questions here, but it strikes me that one of the central connective threads between all three of these pieces is the mid-century turn towards hyper-professionalization of policing, and particularly the, I suppose, intensifying identity of police officers with the job, and sort of the articulation of the job as a unique and moralized form of American labor. So one of the first questions we got was, this is from Milan Rivas, how do we reconcile the relationship of police, representing perhaps our strongest example of organized labor, with other organized labor organizations that they used to actively work to undermine, as several of our panelists outlined. Is the current degree of cooperation and heightened unionization simply the result of political necessity? And I would tack on to that, if people would like to sort of reflect a little bit about this role of labor and professionalization in the recent history, I think that would be a useful place to begin.
First thing I would say is that in terms of the cooperation right now that we see in sort of the labor movement's general support for police unions right now, I very much suspect that that's kind of a one-way street. That the police unions and to a lesser extent, firefighter unions have really kind of carved out a unique spot with conservative politics relative to much of the rest of the labor movement. I mean, I spend a lot of my time in Wisconsin, I was in graduate school when Scott Walker came down with Act 10, which gutted collective bargaining for public employees, but he exempted firefighters and cop unions. And there's a reason for that, right? I mean, it's because these are really, really reactionary. Pardon me, I'm speaking in particular about police unions. They're really, really reactionary political forces, and so I think that the solidarity that labor is showing to police unions right now, I don't think that other pieces of the labor movement should expect that to be reciprocal. I will just say, one thing quick in terms of thinking historically about professionalization and these sorts of things, and the kind of identity of cops as kind of their own sort of to use a gender term, brotherhood. I think that there's a lot of, speaking to what Anna and Stewart both talked about, I think that there's a lot of building of that identity that goes on in the 1950s, and part of it does emanate from proto-police unions, marketing, basically police as marketers, right? This basically is what Stewart's project is about. But how they cultivate an identity for themselves as kind of the protectors and saviors of society. But the thing that I just want to highlight is that one of the things that's really striking for me is that when Chicago gets quote unquote professionalized, when the CPD gets professionalized in the 1960s, it is under Orlando Wilson, right? And Orlando Wilson is kind of the ultimate technocrat. And really what he does is he implements a lot of various processes, policies that are going to make the police department more professionalized, because it was an absolute corrupt mess until 1959, when that suddenly exploded and brought Wilson in. But what happened was that Wilson tried to professionalize the police in a way that would also make them more accountable. So, prior to Wilson coming in 1960, Chicago did not have an internal investigations division in the CPD. Wilson puts it in place. And so we can look at that and say, well, professionalization is good, right? It's helping, it will make cops more accountable. What happened, though, was that the rank and file revolted against him. So, within the first few months of him coming into office, it's the Chicago Patrolmen's Association that launches a concerted effort to get him removed, because they don't want internal investigations. And so what Wilson, like the story of Wilson's career, is professionalization that does things like, formalize stop and frisk, put arrest quotas in place in Black neighborhoods, things that expand the police power. And his expectation was that expanding police power would be accompanied by expanded police accountability, but police embrace the power and reject the accountability. And so that's the legacy of that moment of professionalization. And it's really instructive because, as Anna talked about, professionalization is a really, really thorny thing, because usually what happens is it just serves to expand and enhance police legitimacy and authority, and it doesn't actually do anything that will reduce police harm.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Simon said, and just to emphasize, I think that if we think about professionalization as a kind of top-down implementation of new requirements for officers, as Anna was saying, there is a direct bottom-up reaction that Simon just pointed to, and I think paying attention to both of these dynamics simultaneously is really important to understanding the kind of political mobilization of police. I mean, where they come together is on questions of expanded police power and expanded police budgets. So even though there's this kind of from below police rebellion, and it's been called in the period after the 60s called the Blue Rebellion or even Blue Power, that doesn't end up toppling the kind of professionalization experts. They still remain there, and they come to an accommodation oftentimes around questions of the compensation and other aspects of what police officers jobs are going to be like outside of their patrol routines. So that ends up turning police, creating a form of unity among police, even though there's this kind of internal clash that often was really definitive in a lot of police departments in the period, especially big city police departments in the period of the 60s into the 70s.
Anna, would you like to add to that?
I think those are both great answers. The only thing I would emphasize is, I think, just to underscore what Simon said, I think there's this very interesting relationship between unionization and professionalization at mid-century, where essentially rank and file officers embrace professionalization to the extent that it bolsters their group identity and a certain process of socialization where they begin to identify as professionals who deserve respect, even as they essentially unionize against it, and they mobilize very actively against a lot of the other reforms being pursued by police chiefs and officials. So I think that very intricate give and take between unionization, which in some sense is seen as incompatible with professionalization, and the rise of police professional identity is really a core part of the history.
I think the other current that we should attend to first, and this top voted question from Robert Vargas has to do with this. The question is, are there other cases of long entrenched institutions like police that have been dismantled or radically transformed that we might use to inform today's movement strategies? And I guess this also goes with, Simon asked me to say just briefly that my own work is about the white power movement and the interface between paramilitary cultural currents and radical right white power organizing in the late 20th century. So to me, the thing that comes to mind is the Army. And the way that the Army, as Jennifer Middlestad and others have shown, was radically transformed and professionalized in ways that ended up sort of perhaps unintentionally increasing some of the currents of white power activism that built into the present moment. And I think we might see a similar pattern in policing as well. Would people like to think a little bit about other institutional examples and or this military policing transactional current system? I know that Stewart's work and Simon's work both touch on this heavily. Let me break it apart. Let me back up and just talk about Robert's great question, which is, can we think of other examples of institutions, entrenched institutions that have been dismantled and revised that we might think of to inform today's movement strategies?
I mean, I don't know how much we can rely on it as a blueprint to inform today's movement strategies, but I mean, the institution that first comes to my mind is slavery, which was, people like to think of it as like a sort of regionalized problem, but it wasn't, right? I mean, it was a national patchwork of laws and policies and things like that was absolutely entrenched. And so, I mean, I suppose that's the easy answer, but it's the one that comes most readily to my mind. And again, I don't know, strategically and tactically if there's blueprints there, but I think it is important to sort of like intellectually to understand that there's precedent for institutional, not just reform, but institutional demolition.
I guess maybe I would just come back to the history of 20th century policing, and to point out, as we've already been talking about, that the police forces of the early part of the 20th century operated somewhat differently from how they operate today in terms of their connections to local political machines. And the reform and professionalization movement was designed to sever those links between police forces and political machines. I mean, I think that in a large way that reform effort was successful. The key point for today's questions for activists and movements is that it didn't change the function of policing in terms of social control, as Simon mentioned. So, I think that it's important to recognize that institutions, can be modified and have some nimble actors within them who rethink how they're going to look externally, how they're going to be organized internally, for the purpose of basically preserving a certain type of functional status quo. And I think that's what a lot of us are concerned about, and certainly I think part of the reason that we're seeing the prominence of arguments about defunding, dismantling, abolishing police right now is because the reform efforts that came out of the Obama administration, the 21st Century Task Force on Policing, or whatever it's called, people recognize that they preserved the system. They left it intact. That they did not make thorough changes, and they weren't designed to make thorough changes. And that's why people in the past couple months have been much more savvy and critical, because they're not willing to listen to the same types of claims that these procedural or administrative reforms are going to substantively change the problem.
My research, I admit, does not really touch on this question. So I'm just given committee creep and governance creep, I admit that I am hard pressed for my own work to think of a good example, but I think it's a great question.
And I have a couple of questions here that are directed to you specifically. And some of them get into very specialized legal knowledge. I might, with the forgiveness of the audience, I might invite you to raise those questions directly to Professor Levovsky after the panel, since we have a pretty broad audience here today. But these have to do with sort of, can you say a little bit more about some examples of the kinds of cases where officers are being judged reasonable or being judged expert, and perhaps other framings of how we might rethink standards of conduct and credibility when we think about expert witnesses by police officers. In other words, these talk about agency use of force policy compliant with 4A case law and state laws of use of force. And then Graham versus Connor. I'm sorry, I'm a historian. I don't know what that.
Sure. So I actually I saw the question.
Yes. So okay. So perhaps you can help me summarize. My sense is that all of these questions have to do with the same central point, and that we might sort of extrapolate out.
Right. So I thought. So the two questions are essentially, how does police expertise play into the deferential standard of qualified immunity, I saw as one question, and the other is essentially, how are courts to assess police uses of violence, which is it is essentially a specialized field without deferring to police judgment. So just quickly on the qualified immunity point, I think that's a great example of judicial deference to police judgment as well. I spoke about police expert witnesses and the Fourth Amendment assessment of unreasonable searches and seizures. Judicial deference to police expertise actually permeates the law and has permeated a lot of other judicial encounters with challenged police conduct. That includes entrapment, that very much includes excessive force. And it's certainly a mainstay in the analysis of qualified immunity, which for anyone who's not familiar is essentially it's a doctrine that cuts off legal liability in civil claims where officers do in fact violate the Constitution, but that violation isn't clearly established at the time. So I think absolutely qualified immunity is another doctrine where courts take care to give broad leeway to police judgment and police judgment in their own professional sphere. That said, so one thing is a lot of, to an extent, deferring to police judgment about questions of qualified immunity is about police legal knowledge as much as it is about factual judgment in the field, which is a slightly different form of professional judgment. But I think the most important thing to note with regard to qualified immunity is that judicial deference to police judgment isn't just driven by the presumption of police expertise. A lot of deference is based on the presumption not that police officers are good at their jobs, but instead on the difficulty, on the inevitability of errors in the field, essentially the recognition of the inevitable limitations, professional limitations of police in the field. And I think that's really a key motivating factor guiding a lot of excessive force jurisprudence and qualified immunity. And so in that sense, I want to say the criticizing and the wording courts to criticisms of police expertise itself, I think is unlikely to scale back the generosity of something like qualified immunity or the generosity of judicial assessments of excessive force, because expertise, again, is just one tool the judges use to defer to police judgment. And very, very quickly on how else are courts supposed to do this, if not by deferring to the police. So it is the case that litigation about uses of excessive force and the reasonableness of excessive force often depends on expert testimony that's beyond the court's own or jury's own knowledge. But just a couple of things. First, it's possible to bring in testimony, expert testimony by other officers, that a reasonable officer would have acted differently in a given context, even if the defendant's behavior technically complied with very broadly phrased department policies. It's important to recognize how broad these policies are. It's possible for a range of conduct to be technically compliant with them, even if a veteran officer or a prudent trained officer would testify that he would not have acted the way defendant did. It's also possible to bring in evidence of national practices and national customs beyond a single department. And it is possible also to bring in expert testimony about reasonable uses of force that's not endogenous to the police. So for example, officers aren't the only experts on the only admitted experts on the use of tasers and similar weapons. So the key point is that it's possible for courts to rely on other expert testimony to assess what a reasonable officer should have done in a particular moment that's not reliant on a particular department's often very vague, again, policies, formal policies.
Great. I want to just keep moving here because we're running short on time and we have quite a few questions in the queue. This is from Melissa Smith, who thanks you for your research and asks, all of you have mentioned the importance of individual actors and their relationships in shaping policing in the US and abroad. But I'm wondering how you think cultural representations of police and policing on a larger scale over the past 50-ish years may have influenced the thinking and orientation of those actors.
I guess one thing that I would just say is that the cultural representations of police have been shaped by police, deeply. So when we look at the kind of most classic originary police procedural TV show, Dragnet, the LAPD and specifically William Parker, who was a very powerful chief in Los Angeles, played a direct role in shaping the representation of policing in that show. And in some sense, Parker was a deep believer in proceduralism and in kind of standardization. And the show itself was meant to illustrate that. And none of the kind of problems of the LAPD or of mid-century police that historians, that we're all, amply documenting, those didn't really factor into those representations. And I would just say, just to kind of bring it to my own research, the public safety program overseas, thought of police PR as a crucial piece of the puzzle. And in fact, the LAPD officer whose job was to kind of be the liaison between the TV show and Parker, the Office of Public Safety hired him and sent him overseas. So again, these networks are really extensive and transnational, and I really do believe that cultural representations of policing are important and powerful. I feel like I tend to think of myself as not the kind of person who generally puts a lot of weight on culture, but actually, like in what I study, I think it actually matters a great deal, and so it's important for us to keep that in mind.
I'll jump in real quick, and I'll just my first point is to just stay in LA. One of the other things that William Parker did was to he launched this apparently very shitty and very short-lived TV show, but the TV show was called The Thin Blue Line. And it was, an absolute commercial flop. It didn't take off, but it did implant into the public consciousness that image of the police as that thin blue line protecting, civilization from anarchy. And so, to Stewart's point, I think it's critical to understand that the propaganda as that we see kind of proliferating in American society, it doesn't just happen that the police play a really active role in that. And actually, a thing, speaking of culture, something that people might be interested in, there is a podcast that it came out last year. Everything seems like it was decades ago at this point, but I think it was just last year. There was a podcast called Running from Cops that it was a limited edition run, and it's part of a larger podcast, I think. But anyways, it was just a season of some other podcast, I believe, but it's called Running from Cops. And it really looks at, the shows and the impact and the racism, or pardon me, let me back up. It looks at shows like Cops, but also Live PD and these other cultural institutions that are really just celebrating the work of policing. And it looks at a lot at how, the racisms of those shows, but also at the kind of cultural imprint that those shows have left, and also looks at how the police play a really, really integral role in shaping the content of those shows.
Including Dragnet, those are all my favorite examples of essentially a very active police entanglement in the production of popular culture. I just wanted to jump in to say that I think yesterday Alex Vitale drew this useful distinction between what we think of as the traditional sites of production of popular culture and also popular news media, essentially, or mainstream news media, and to emphasize that the police were very actively, of course, involved in both in a very systematic manner. So reformist organizations like the International Association of the Chiefs of Police actually had a public relations committee that was dedicated to essentially reaching out not only to the producers of Dragnet, but also to radio shows, to newspaper editors. Local police departments followed the same example. So again, I think there's a very, very active, proactive process of shaping the public narrative around the police.
Yes, I'm gonna just jump on to the next question here. There are a number of questions that are all pushing a little bit further, asking you to think about where we begin with this history, where we might use this history to move into action. And one from Katrina asks, I'm curious if this panelist could speculate a bit. Thank you all for providing these important counts of the origins, infrastructure, and institutionalization of the police and policing practices. All the panelists have spoken to how the police as an institution, how it is embedded and tied to other institutions and fields, given the ways that police expertise is constructed and how the imperatives are rooted in imperialist and racist, she says, ends, I might add, histories. What are the critical entry points for change? And then down below that in the thread, we see a few other comments around where institutional reform might begin, what it looks like. I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but one of the questions embedded in these questions, is this a thing that can be reformed? Or is this a thing where we need to start over? Is there a point where the history of policing has become so entrenched with these other systems, these other histories of violence, these other histories of oppression, that it is an institution that can't be redeemed. And one of the things that I want to highlight is, one of the things that I take away from these three papers is that when we hear reform, that should not signify that things are getting better. Sometimes that signifies a system of cover through which things are continuing, but without the public outcry and social protest that we see now that shines a light on some of what's happening. So I'd like to invite you to, we've got about 10 minutes left, 8 minutes left. I'd like to invite each panelist to sort of speculate about or give us your takeaway about what we should do with this history.
I'll just start with a couple of thoughts. I think I didn't really discuss my other historical research on the history of gay life, but this is going to be perhaps a facile answer, but that's a context where the effect of reform was decriminalization. And there wasn't really a lot of talk about that we should maintain sodomy laws. Certainly among activists, we should maintain sodomy laws. We should have greater oversight of entrapment and enticement practices. The move was always for decriminalization, and that was effective to some extent. Of course, it just reshifted the focus of policing on other marginalized groups within the queer community. But in terms of if we're interested in institutional reform, I think that my primary takeaway from the research I've done into judicial reasoning about the police is that we have to think about reforming not just the police, but also this broader constellation of legal institutions that are bound up with the police. You have to think about reforming the courts and trying to essentially change this vicious cycle where the repeat players that judges are encountering are prosecutorial players, prosecutors and police officers, where judges are systematically encountering police officers in a very flattering light in cases where their investigative practices led to evidence, led to actual charges. So you can imagine doing this in a number of ways. You could imagine just education programs that introduce judges to the actual hit rates or success rates of police investigation in the field. You can imagine other efforts to make judges more aware, I should say, than they should be so far of illegality or incompetence within the legal system. You could fund public defenders to allow them to try to essentially counteract some police expert testimony in court, bring in their own experts about criminological patterns or ethnographic patterns within certain cities and certain communities to say that actually these practices are common. These aren't necessarily indicative of crime. It is hard for me to avoid the conclusion that's really tinkering around the edges of the problem, but that's the type of reform that I would think about.
I would echo what Anna said and point out that there is a broader institutional matrix that needs to be addressed, and extends even farther into thinking about our cities and our economies, our institutions, that we need to take into account. I guess I would, I saw a question about privatization, and maybe I can just kind of circle into that. The history of the Office of Public Safety that I examine in the book, it comes to an end. This is an institution that's abolished. It's defunded. Activists call for it to be shut down, and it was shut down by Congress in 1974-75. So that was a successful movement-based push to rein in what the United States was doing as far as policing went overseas. At the same time, it created a whole new range of institutions, including new private institutions. So some of the people who were doing this work overseas as public safety advisors basically just started private corporations to keep doing the same exact type of work, and they would no longer get their checks from the Agency for International Development. Instead, they would get their checks from the sovereign governments of other countries, and they were probably a lot bigger at that point. So I think the history is a cautionary one. On the one hand, there are these examples of movement successes to rein in what are perceived to be abusive institutions. At the same time, the details really matter, because although what ended up happening was that Congress prohibited police assistance, and that prohibition is still on the books, and yet the United States is giving police assistance, on an even grander scale now than it was to other countries than it was in the 70s. And so there were loopholes in the prohibition that really mattered and created new possibilities. And then there was the rise of a private sector that of course we live with today. So it just kind of points to the necessity of really deep strategic thinking on the part of activists. I mean, I think the activists, when this happened in the 70s and they saw these loopholes come into the legislation, they were astonished. They not because they didn't see it coming, they just felt betrayed. So I think that is something that's important to think about going forward for our movements that are demanding defunding and abolition.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a ton to add. I guess mostly because I mean, that's the $1,000,000 question, right? Is where, what next? I guess what I would say to circle back to a point that I made when I was first speaking at the beginning is that I think that it's really, really important to think locally when it comes to this. I mean, I know that there are obviously, I mean, as we've talked about, I mean, there are national and international currents that shape what policing looks like and things like that. But when it comes to actual efforts to radically reimagine policing, including radically imagining a world without police, I think that is going to happen more. It's going to be more effective to think about that from a local approach, because that's where these decisions are actually going to be made, right? And so I think that history is instructive in that, and also, I mean, I would come back to, I mean, one of the things that I think is important for people to know in this moment is that the conditions are unique, but the struggle itself is not. And so I think that it's important to understand. And one of the things I was trying to do with my book was to show how, this extremely anti-Black system of policing takes shape in Chicago, but also the ways in which Black folk and allies, contested that. And so I think that there is utility in also understanding that this is, that there's a continuum of struggle that we right now are part of, and I guess maybe on the one hand, that's dispiriting to know that, folks in early 70s Chicago, almost 50 years ago, were essentially making defunding arguments then, and we've only seen the CPD's budget just bloat and bloat and bloat and bloat instead at the cost of other social goods. But I think it also, I mean, there's precedent and there's examples for the things that we are demanding now, and I think that there is utility in knowing that history, in the sense that at least it's a little bit fortifying, I think, to know that we're not just on an island, without any sort of context.
So with that, we are at our time. I want to thank all of our panelists for an excellent conversation today, and thank you to everyone who joined us. For more than 150 people at one point. It's really lovely to see people engaging with this history, which is a difficult history, and with this conversation, which is a difficult one too. So I wish you all the best. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and I hope we will all be in conversation along the way. Thank you.